Hello and welcome everyone to our 2023 National Science Week seminar for the Problem-Based Learning in STEM Education project. My name is Dr. Jennifer Mansfield and it gives me great pleasure to be your host for this evening. I would like to start by acknowledging the lands on which we're all beaming in from tonight and to recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to specifically acknowledge that the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, communities of the Kulin Nations, are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University stands and in which I'm coming from, in which I am located this evening. We pay our respects to our research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Bunurong elders and their past, present and future communities. I also would like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us this evening. As I welcome you to please let us know where you are streaming from tonight, and also welcome you to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which you might be located. And please feel free to put those in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. As the destinations roll in, I do wish to acknowledge our partner organisations in this project, Melbourne Archdiocese of Catholic Schools, and our partner investigator there, Shelley Waldron. I also want to acknowledge Brisbane Catholic Education and our partner investigator there, Charlotte Pizarro, the University of Queensland, RMIT, and our amazing partner schools in Victoria and Brisbane. A big shout out to our Brisbane team tonight, Carly, Rochelle and the team, who are hosting a watch party at Woolloongabba. Thank you very much to BCU for hosting this evening, and it's great to see you all. I can see you all there, and Peter is with you as well. Thank you everyone who's putting their locations and the traditional lands that they are on into the chat. It's good to see that we've got people joining us from so many different destinations. Thank you for joining us this evening. To everyone here and to those watching the recording, we encourage discussions and questions about what we're going to discuss today. We encourage you to put questions in the chat as we're going, and also to continue the conversation via social media so we can keep the conversations going. We encourage you to use Twitter X to tweet throughout and after the presentation, and the hashtags will be on the screen there. Hashtag the STEM Problem National Science Week, and you can also tag in Monash Education. This is our second seminar for the project, and we're looking forward to showcasing the valuable work that's been done over the last 12 months since our last seminar. The project Exploring Problem-Based Learning in School-Based STEM Education was initiated with the intention to enhance STEM learning in schools. Problem-based learning has been used widely in tertiary education to effectively support meaningful and relevant student learning in many STEM-related areas, such as medicine and engineering. While many school-based teachers value problem-based learning as part of STEM education, a shared and consistent understanding of what characterises this approach to teaching and learning was not necessarily evident in school-based practice. There was also limited research available to support the effective use of PBL in school-based STEM education, which is why this project was underway. In this project, teachers from Melbourne Archdiocese of Catholic Schools and Brisbane Catholic Education Schools have been empowered to investigate their use and understanding of problem-based learning in their individual contexts. We've got our QR code for our website there on these slides, so you can see our partner organisations there in more detail. This project to date has published findings from research conducted with expert focus groups and an extensive literature review. 4 key interrelated principles of problem-based learning have been identified, and you can see those on the screen here, namely flexible knowledge, skills and capabilities, active and strategic metacognitive reasoning, collaboration based on intrinsic motivation, and rich and relevant learning contexts. Across the life of the project, teachers have been investigating and interrogating their practice through the lenses of these 4 principles. In the seminar today, we're going to hear from teachers working in the 4 partner schools in this project. These teachers are going to share their experiences with what their research has taught them about problem-based learning in STEM education in their specific school-based contexts. After that, we're then going to have a panel discussion facilitated by 2 of our project academics, Associate Professor Kathy Smith and Dr. Peter Allison. We'll then follow that with a Q&A session And we encourage you to enter any questions you may have at any time through the first part of the evening. For our panelists, in the chat as you go along, if you can just, with your question, pop who you would like to direct your question to, that would be great. If you would like to find out more about the project, access our publications, please follow the QR code which is on the screen now to our website. So I think without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Billy Roberts, to turn on his camera and mic as I give him a brief introduction. Billy is the acting head of mathematics and the lead teacher on the Assisi STEM project, STEM PBL project at Assisi Catholic College, Upper Coomera in Queensland. Thank you, Billy.
Okay, so I'm privileged tonight to be able to speak to Assisi's journey in the STEM PBL program. So for a bit of context, we're a P12 school on the Gold Coast that engages in STEM learning experiences across all 4 of our precincts. So we're Franciscan College with a strong community culture who are lucky enough to teach a student body who yearn for opportunities to express these values in their learning. So we were unique in that we already had a STEM program across 7 to 8 enacted by our leadership team. So what the STEM PBL project allowed us to do was to reflect on the purpose of our STEM program and whether it best reflected our school systems and values. So for us, our learning context prior to the program was all about space. And while we were really happy about that, and we found that students gained skills from the projects, we didn't quite find that they were particularly connected to or engaged with that context. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a STEM program that was inclusive for all students of all ability levels, meaning that we needed a program with a low floor for entry and a high ceiling for students looking to challenge themselves. So the idea of project-based learning seemed most appropriate for that mission, and it allowed us to present students with a problem that students of all ability levels could access. So during our first PBL session, one of the key takeaways was this idea of rich and relevant learning contexts, and that really spoke to us. So what we wanted our year STEM course to act as was an expression of our school values. So we wanted to empower our students to enact the learning in the classroom and consider the impact that they'll have on their communities. So what I noticed when I joined Assisi Catholic College was just how wonderful our students were. So they're just these kind, empathetic students who are just so eager to have an impact on their community. So we wanted to leverage the strengths of our students as people to enhance their experience as learners. So we wanted our students to have the opportunity to explore what it meant to be an Assisi student and how those Franciscan values could represent the cornerstone of a problem-solving approach. So I believe in terms of creating those rich and relevant learning contexts in your school communities, it's about going back to those first principles and thinking about what it is that makes your school community. So find those values that are embedded deep within your community and build from there. So your students will appreciate the opportunity to express themselves as a member of their community and have an impact that lasts. So for me, it's about finding those values, holding on to them proudly and making them the cornerstone of your work when you're integrating these projects. So think about those logistics of the program later and create something that your students will be proud to be a part of. So for me, it's about convincing students that they can have an impact on their community, not in 5 years or 10 years, but now. And then I think that's the most important thing that we can do. And it's proved transformative for us in our STEM context. So as you can imagine, when we're building this STEM program, we need it to be high ceiling. We're trying to make an expression of our values. So I was pretty emotionally invested in it. So once you start thinking about all the different directions open-ended experiences can go, you can get attached to how you think the students should be learning. For me, open-ended teaching is really scary, and the habits that we pick up from traditional teaching can be really hard to shake. So I knew that going for an open-ended project-based learning experience to work, I needed to give the students the opportunity to fail. So I think I was so invested in this project working that there were moments when students were failing and I jumped in too early to save them. So in doing so, the first round of student solutions we had actually ended up on rails. Our students ended up doing really similar things, even though I was actively thinking in my head that I wanted them all to be different. So I sort of walked out of that first run of our program really quite shocked that the projects had ended up so similar. So what we did as a STEM team is we sat down and we undertook a second run of the program that we started to really embrace open-ended learning. So we went in with a mindset that the process was going to be somewhat uncomfortable and that there was a genuine possibility that it might not work. So I communicated to the team that if it didn't work, it was on me, and that they genuinely were completely free to take the risk and let the students express themselves. So what followed from that was a range of products that floored us. So we found that when you give students permission to be brilliant, they'll often surprise you. So I think they have a much greater capacity for creativity than we do. And when they were taken off the rails, they really did surprise us. So my final piece of advice is to be brave, back your teaching teams and back your students. The students have the capacity to make us look uncreative when you let them go off the rails. So I genuinely think this is such a fantastic way to approach teaching STEM, but it does require bravery, total commitment to the process, and the trust of your students. So when you take the students off the rails, they can really achieve something special. So I'd also just like to take a moment to thank everyone involved in the project, as it's been such a wonderful chance for CC College to transform our STEM program. So we've been privileged to work with everyone as a part of the process, and we're so excited to see what our students continue to do as they start to believe they can have an impact on our communities. So that's what we're doing at a CC Catholic College.
Fantastic. Thank you, Billy. Kath?
Oh, Billy, what an inspiring presentation. There's a few things that really jumped out to me as I was listening to you there, and that is how the project gave you the opportunity to reflect on and clarify your purpose in terms of teaching and learning, and how important that was as part of the process. I also noticed that you made a point of emphasizing how important it is to know your students, that's a really central part of the problem-based learning approach. And you wanted your students to be active, to have an immediate impact, and you wanted your students to feel proud of what they were undertaking. They're really powerful words. But I think you've left us with a key message too, that this can be quite risky business for teachers because the way you begin to work with your students actually starts to be quite different from the way you were working before. And I think your most powerful statement that will stay with me, and I think I've heard you say this before, Billy, is that when you give your students permission to be brilliant, you produce amazing surprises for the teachers who are working with them. Thanks very much, Billy.
Thank you so much.
I now welcome Sandra to turn on her camera and mic, please. Sandra Boykos, our next speaker, is the STEAM leader and visual arts teacher at St Columba's College in Essendon in Victoria. Welcome, Sandra, and I welcome you to let us know about what you're doing there at St Columba's.
Hi everyone. So I'm from St Columba's College. Our school boasts a robust and enriching project learning program, and it strives to foster creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and real-world problem-solving skills among our students. Basically, it's a week-long program where our Year 10 students have a whole week of working in a job cluster of their choice. At Years 9 and 10, we have careers subjects. So if you look at the slide, you'll see that Year 9, we have what we call future directions, and Year 10 is exploring pathways. And so what those 2 year levels do is obviously look at all things careers, but they also look at the subjects that they may need to study for the pathway that they believe they'd like to follow post-secondary school. At times it's daunting for them, obviously given their age, but this is important because by the time the Year 9s hit Year 10 and they come up to Year 10 and start looking at the job clusters that they may work in, we're behind the scenes preparing opportunities for them to work in their chosen fields. And so how this works is we look at the Institute for the Future job clusters, and those students by this stage, and I'm talking about Year 10s, by this stage are choosing their subjects for the following year, what to study in Year 11. So they're looking at the job clusters as well and choosing where they think they might want to work in. Once they're in that job cluster, our team starts organising outside organisations to come in and work with us on a 1-week PBL program. So we have amazing opportunities where we work with Amazon, we work with Victoria, Metropolitan Roads Alliance. They come in and they work with our students. On the first day, they go out and they're immersed in that job area, in that organisation. They go on an excursion, and the organisation will just say it's Amazon. Amazon will put together a design brief for the students working in the job cluster. And we believe that this is a really rich and relevant learning context for our students. They go through those design thinking. But one of the problems, and I'm coming out of left field here, but one of the problems we encounter, or the challenges we encounter, is with full buy-in from our teachers. Because we need help from our teachers to supervise this program. There are a team of teachers dedicated to it, but if you can imagine 8 teachers who quite possibly teach VCE at the same time can't supervise every single lesson in that week for PBL. So we rely on some of the other teachers to come in. Their buy-in is important, but we struggle. Usually they're coming in and they're assessing their work that they've got from other classes. Why they do this, there's a myriad of possibilities as to why they do this. Because they're not invested in the actual program, they're struggling to understand what PBL is, and sometimes it's not just PBL, it's a variety of STEM approaches that they don't like to get too involved in. So we've been trying to address this problem at our college by having some PD days that involve some PBL and some PD around STEM. Here we've got some photos of just tackling some problem, bringing up some games and some questions about in our staff meetings. Sometimes it's a 15-minute conversation, a cork versus a screw cap. Anything that gets conversation going. And what we're trying to do is get them involved in that PBL thinking and getting them to understand how worthwhile it is. So yes, from my end, whilst the program is really rich and relevant, the teacher buy-in is where we're struggling with and having some problems. The second problem when you start organising the programs and starting to get outside organisations involved is businesses don't run in the same way that schools run. So if you're getting a tertiary institution involved, say like RMIT, well, their holidays are very different to, they usually take holidays about the time we're having our PBL on. So we have challenges trying to fit the program in around businesses, but for the most part, it's been a really rewarding thing for our students. And I think the program is a really worthwhile one. It's just about maybe training, giving our teachers a little bit more confidence, showing how important that type of learning is, and maybe supporting our teachers a little bit more to understand that.
Lovely. Thank you, Sandra. That's fantastic. Peter, I welcome you to offer your insights about Sandra's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jen. Yeah, that was terrific. Thank you, Sandra. Real world, rich and relevant learning context is, of course, essential to all of this. And I'm really fascinated by the way you have linked this very explicitly to this job cluster notion. I think that's terrific. We often talk about 21st century skills as things we pay attention to as we're doing something, but I really quite like the idea, and I encourage people to think about this as a question later, about the extent to which simply a focus on PBL can provide those 21st century learning contexts without necessarily having to, unpack them explicitly. I think that's a really powerful idea. I think what you can see in the PBL potential here about being generators, designers, informers, coordinators, even artisans, is really interesting. And we see this in the PBL work across all the contexts with the school. So that how generative this is, I think speaks wonderfully to the variety that you've suggested in terms of the job cluster and the demands of the future. And I also love the fact that you've got teachers on screen doing the exact same activities that you would have students doing. I think this is something we don't do as much as we should do. And I think that's really interesting to see how that will then bring home the importance of some of these ideas to teachers. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you, Sandra. I now welcome Kathy Hunt to please turn on her microphone. I see you there, Kath. Kath is the curriculum leader for years 9 and 10 at Macaulay College, Beaudesert in Queensland. I now welcome you, Kath, to tell us about what you're doing at your school.
Hi, everybody, and get ready, Tab, because we've got a wild ride with 12 slides in 5 minutes, and I am super excited to chat today. There's nothing that makes me more excited than talking about what the students are doing at Macaulay. Time flies with 5 minutes. So my one big idea for us is that really I guess the big reflection piece for us has been that classroom thinking is the hero of this project at Macaulay at the moment. So we're on a journey as a very young school in Beaudesert, Queensland. 6 years old as a school, we started a STEAM project that really was about engagement in cross-curricular learning. We identified some pretty big gaps in what our students were able to do across the silos of learning that were happening in the classrooms on arrival in a high school context. So that separatism was a bit of an issue. And although the 21st century skills were things that we knew to be valuable, we didn't really see them being explicitly addressed in the teaching and learning programs as we would have liked to. So we had this sort of aspiration to go ahead with a vision that was really about connection. We wanted inquiry-based learning through essential questions that were explored in a really dynamic problem-solving way that honored those 21st century learning skills that build knowledge through real-world context and achievable with the limited of these programs. We developed this interactive notebook space that allowed our students and teachers to really get on board. It was called for success, and thinking about our gradual release of responsibility, we could pull away those scaffolds for year 7s as they worked through into year 8, 9, and eventually more self-directed, larger scale projects in year 10. And so hopefully through those little pages, you'll get the examples that these are digital interactive spaces created for iPads where students can create things where they record thinking, sketch, use voice memos, take videos, whatever it is that will help their planning. They're really encouraged to think about how their brain is working with explicit language and teaching around those metacognitions, and then to collaborate and create artifacts of their labor on their mobile devices while they're doing. And so this provides a really tangible kind of conduit to all of those assessment things that we know are very important. But it's a really student-driven, authentic kind of place to really work out how you can be useful. And so I love that students can get on with the busyness of learning anytime, anywhere, and they've got something that will inform the next steps along their project design. So this STEAM learning model that Tabitha's got here for us really turns into something that becomes useful in ways that you wouldn't expect. If you can go to the next slide for me there, Tab, you'll see that students create things like a planner that works for them to talk to their teacher about how they're going to plan out a project, which on the next page you'll see is kind of important when you're building something like this. This is a very complex construction where students are working out how the heck to build something that might become a pop-up tent for the homeless in Beaudesert. So next slide, we've actually got students in this same course who are presenting projects that have never achieved a passing grade in year 8 or 9 science, technology or maths, and they're like those pop-up tents for the homeless, like communication radio systems. It's pretty exciting stuff. So if you flick to the next slide there, Tabitha, you'll see that, you know, again, we've got an interactive sort of space here where our students are really encouraged to show what they know. And it's been brilliant to see all of the school get on board when we have our STEAM fairs and really broadcast all of that knowledge. And for us, the next step now is really unpacking what collaboration looks like and why it's so important in our college with the same explicit use of vocabulary. So now it's time for us to take the project a little bit further and to connect up with the critical thinking project that we're also a part of, kind of tying all of these knots together in a beautiful kind of patchwork. I really think that the last slide is probably my favorite of all, because even though it's the end, it's really just the beginning. As we look at the projects that the students are creating way back at our year 7 level here, I think what's really important to reflect on is that with a research project like this, really give us opportunity to plan for activities, selection between colleagues, with the opportunity to talk to people who are also tapping into best practice from other locations, other year levels, other schools. We really wouldn't be able to achieve the fantastic dynamic classroom experiences that we're seeing at Macaulay. And certainly we're really excited to share back the things that are going well and the lessons learned some days on campus at Macaulay. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and looking forward to more dialogue from here.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kathy. And I just welcome Kath to give some insights on your presentation.
Wow, Kath, that was a great presentation. It was really good. I mean, it's a unique situation at Macaulay with a school that is only 6 years old and growing. So it's this wonderful opportunity to be at the beginning of all of these wonderful processes. I think you raised some really powerful points that would resonate with teachers in other schools, particularly that desire to want to have cross-curriculum learning, but dealing with the siloed structures that often exist within schools around timetable programs and disciplined areas. And that becomes problematic for building, as you said, such connections and deep inquiry projects that students can really undertake. I loved the way you talked about starting small. I think that's a really powerful message that seems to have emerged a lot from the schools that we're working with. The reflection aspect becomes so important, and I noticed Billy said this earlier and you reiterated that again. Reflection for students, and to be thinking about their own self-awareness of how they're feeling, decisions that they're making. And you also emphasised, of course, the role of reflection for teachers who are collaborating together. You had a lot of strategies in your presentation that actually enabled teachers to make student thinking really explicit and tangible, and I thought that was really powerful. And also how wonderful to think that PBL has opened opportunities for all students to experience success. And you've now arrived at this point where you're exploring collaboration, which we have found to be the cornerstone of problem-based learning. This is a theme, you know, it's one of the principles, but it keeps coming out time and time again. And look at this picture that's here with the students with their arms around each other. What a powerful note to finish on in terms of collaboration. Everybody matters. Everybody's contributing most of the time, and together we can achieve more when we're working that way. Thanks so much, Kath.
Thank you, Kath. Appreciate it. And thank you, Kathy, for your great presentation. Michael and Daniel, I now welcome you to unmute and turn on your cameras. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our last teacher speakers for this evening. Daniel Green is the Year 9 Learning Leader, and Michael Ling is a STEM teacher at St Peter's College, Clyde North in Victoria. Welcome, Daniel and Michael.
Hi, thank you. STEM at St Peter's is part of a larger program at Year 9. It's focused, we started out focusing on just trying to beat the engagement slump at Year 9 level. And we were really interested at the outset in developing collaboration based on that intrinsic motivation. In order to give ourselves space and time to do that, our program boils down some of our classes. So STEM at St Peter's Clyde North, we've got 2 campuses at Year 9 level, actually takes fills the whole role of science and maths classes. That creates some issues for us, and we'll talk about that in a second. So like I said, from the outset, we were trying to engage the students in those rich, relevant learning contexts. And we actually found that surprisingly easy to do, because we have a lot of science teachers around who have that little spark in their mind that goes, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could teach this way, if we could combine these ideas and put them together in a big project. And giving ourselves the space in our timetable has really allowed us to do that. And we've really seen amazing success in the engagement we see out of students. Sometimes seeking the partnerships that are required to build out those contexts has been a bit of a challenge, but every time we put together a big, interesting idea, the students really jump at it. And the difference in, say, students turning up to their regular maths or science class that they had 5 years ago to turning up to STEM is really, really gratifying, that we know that we've got that engagement. The challenge that we kind of have by taking up that time is that now we have the obligation to meet all of those curriculum and reporting expectations. And that's been a challenge for us. How do we tick curriculum boxes for maths and science within our STEM program and maintain that real context and that engagement without kind of breaking the magic? I'm going to handball over to Dan now, and he'll talk a little bit more through what we've done.
The current metrics that we were using to measure student success, which was a lot of sort of standardized testing, wasn't really allowing us to capture all the skills that we were wanting students to learn and that we were seeing in the classroom in PBL and STEM. And we set about developing developmental frameworks, which we refer to as criterion reference frameworks. And whilst we found that worked really well for our maths and science, it became a little bit more complex and difficult to develop for your skills, such as collaboration and critical thinking. And there's a bit of an argument as to and ongoing debate as to whether you can actually, in fact, teach and assess these skills. But we wanted to, because we were identifying groups that were able to collaborate more effectively, and when observing these particular groups and watching what they would do, and we would try to just take those observable behaviors and articulate them in a way that other groups in the future could use that as a measure of their own measure of success. So it's really prompted us to utilize more forms of assessment. One, so that we can make sure that our program stays viable and that we're meeting and students are having success in the maths and science curriculum, but that students are also getting the opportunity to develop those really important life skills as well.
We found that we ended up with, we've got engagement. We now have ways that we can both meet and assess those flexible knowledge and skills to meet the kind of requirements of our, to meet the standardized kind of assessment kind of vibes that we're getting from just curriculum requirements, but also really validating the goals of what we were aiming for in starting a PBL project. So after getting that kind of success, we wanted to know what was next. How are we going to build this out? How can we make sure that we're feeding students' ability to solve these problems? Because that's the big goal in the end. We want them to come out better problem solvers. We need them to be future problem solvers. So while going through that, we really, in this project, realized that we were talking the language of metacognition, but we're finding it very difficult to build metacognition in students. And we could see the difference between students who could think, who had those metacognitive tools, and the students who didn't. And students who were able to use active and strategic metacognitive reasoning were amazing problem solvers, and they took the projects and the problems that we raised and were able to run with them. And they were the ones that produced amazing things. But we felt maybe we were leaving behind some of the kids that were that didn't have that toolkit, and we needed to be able to show that we were bringing them with us. So at the moment, we're working on improving our toolkit that improves their toolkit on that active and strategic metacognitive reasoning.
Pete, I would like to throw to our panel discussion, but what I might do is I'm just going to invite all the speakers to please turn on their cameras and be ready to unmute. I'm going to throw to you, Pete, to do a little reflection on that and then take us into our discussion section, if you wouldn't mind, if that's not too big an ask.
Absolutely, that's terrific, Jen.
Perfect, thanks, Pete.
Look, thank you, Michael and Daniel. Yeah, that was really interesting. And I would love to ask the question that everybody's thinking, which is, what are these rubrics? What are these metrics? I think that's really important. What I think is really powerful, of course, is that, and I think, to my way, I think this is one of the big lessons from what you're doing, is that you are teachers acting as scientists here. You are within some kind of theoretical framework, framing some interesting questions and really doing some intense observation to try and determine what behaviours and thinking are involved in these processes, to try and develop these metrics and determine how they're teachable. I think we cannot underestimate how powerful this is. for teaching as a profession to do this. And I think that's really fantastic that you've done that. So perhaps my first question might be to you, and I appreciate the problems you've had about collaboration and other things, including that in the metrics, is that have you found that the metrics you've developed have been clear to other people, and they've seen what you mean when you speak to them and share them with others? And that can be to Michael or Daniel. Yeah.
No problem. And Michael might want to partly answer this question as well. It's probably different depending on who you ask. It seems to be, as I mentioned before, a bit of an ongoing debate. But I think a lot of people wouldn't argue the value of being able to collaborate effectively. And I think it's really important that we provide opportunities for students to become the most effective collaborators they can be. But it's not just enough to put them in positions where they have to collaborate and hope for the best and hope that they'll learn how to get better at it. There needs to be, just like with any teaching, some sort of guidance, and whether that's through modelling, whether that's through providing maybe more explicit teaching of certain strategies that can be used. So we like I said before, we sort of observed the behaviours of groups that we found were collaborating very effectively, and we also had a conversation, the development of this particular rubric, and it's not perfect to any means, and it's still something that undergoes scrutiny all the time. But we sort of worked on that for a few years, and really try to boil down what it means to collaborate, and what that might look like, what kind of those putting in those observable behaviours, and then we've tried to provide more explicit teaching of those particular behaviours.
Daniel was maybe not clear. It took us about 3 years to write the criteria. We've used it with students, and we definitely can see we can hand the students this rubric, and we can point out where they are on the rubric on any of the continuums and say, okay, next, to improve your collaboration, you need to do this. And we're definitely seeing that they have a clearer understanding of what they're missing and where they should be going.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Michael and Daniel. I think this is a really important idea. We were having the conversation just here earlier too, that appreciating that the skills of collaboration are not something that's magically happens. They have to be taught explicitly. And this explains in many cases why teachers might say, well, I've tried that and it didn't work. But we have to teach these skills. So I think that's a fascinating idea. We look forward to seeing those in the fullness of time, and we can share those. Can I throw to you, Kath, for some ideas there?
Sure. Thanks very much, Pete. Yeah, what a great presentation that was. And I think one of the things that this project has done really powerfully is position teachers as researchers. And Daniel and Michael gave us a really fantastic example there of the uncertainty around being a researcher and how, you don't know the answers when you start investigating these things. And so that was really inspirational work. Billy, I want to come back to you with a question, if that's okay. One of the principles, or a couple of the principles that we talk about a lot in this project relate to intrinsic motivation and also active and strategic metacognitive reasoning. And we've said all the way through this project that while we are trying to develop these dispositions and skills in students, we are also finding that teachers themselves are working to develop these dispositions and skills in their own professional practice and their decision making. Billy, I was intrigued when you said be brave. And one of the questions that came to my mind was, why did you persist with this when the process became really challenging? What was it that was driving your intrinsic motivation where other teachers would have walked away and given up?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. And I think part of it is, and a big part of it is because we had a leadership team that backed us, and we had a team that knew that this process was going to work. We felt that this was the best way for our students to engage with that learning. And it's easy to be brave when you feel safe, and our leadership team was backing us the entire way to continue pushing through this process. In terms of how we knew, we were confident that if we had a program that spoke to the values of our students, that the students would come through. And I think the fear was more not because we were worried that it would fail necessarily, but we were worried it wouldn't work as well as we thought we could. So that jumping in that moment and that over scaffolding was more, we had this idea of what it looked like and the students had a slightly different idea. So it was more about finding a moment for those ideas to converge, more so than us being worried that it wouldn't work at all. So we were confident because we had that bedrock of our culture that we could build a learning experience based on that. And we knew that if we could find an answer to that, and if we could find a way for it to work, and if we could find a way to integrate that culture into our teaching practices, we knew that that was so valuable. So we had a leadership team that backed us, and we also knew that the value of continuing to try and make it work was worth more than the risk of it failing.
Thanks so much, Billy. That's really interesting because we know that our students often give up, but also it's hard for teachers to persist with things too when, the going gets a little bit tough. So that was a great insight. Pete, back to you if you want to shoot through another question.
Yeah, there's so much to say. Thanks, Kath. We were joking that we might need to be here until midnight to do this properly, but that's okay. We'll do what we can. Kathy, in your work, you've said some fascinating things about the work, and you shared something that Billy said, I think, about the notion that the number of pathways that students have to acquire, not constricting those, but expanding them. Going back to the idea of permission to be brilliant, if you like, but this notion of many degrees of freedom in their inquiry was a really a powerful idea, and sort of getting out of their way a little bit to do that, and showing in that students who have not had success in traditional STEM programs are having success in problem-based learning. What do you think it is about that getting out of their way idea that's giving them success in the project?
Yeah, I think the first thing is trust. It's so important and something we probably haven't discussed enough of. And, that relational aspect is something that I saw coming through, Billy's presentation a moment ago, just so powerfully. If that relationship with the teacher is strong, all things are confident. And if that is occurring in a beautifully safe space, the conditions for learning, are set. And I think of things a lot, I guess, with the heart of an artist that I have. And I just know that if I can create the conditions for yes, with the directions that the students want to take, they would probably have a really beautiful opportunity for a beginning. And so in designing the learning opportunities, I think that what I'm really looking for is something that's open-ended enough to create goes on behind the scenes in a way that's appropriate. And in that respect, we've always started with a partnership. So it's about, going on that journey beside them, not so much out in front and certainly not behind them, and really thinking about what it is that they can do to develop some ownership over where they're going with their learning. The notebooks have become a really interesting part of that because the students have always felt this connection, this little bit of a sense of safety. There's this life raft of something familiar. It's allowed them to develop tools along the way that, give them that place to go to where there's not just a common language with the vocabulary that we use, but something where they know explicitly what the teacher is going to ask of them in terms of artifacts for the learning and things like that. So that really the nuts and bolts of what we would expect for assessment or what we'd want to be recording for them, the day-to-day things with teaching are taken care of for them. So that when we do say to them, you can, in this aspect of the tasks, really go forward and follow your goals, we're not actually, doing something where we're going to change our mind down the track in teacher land and say, oh, but now it has to conform to this criteria, or now you've gone too far and I didn't really mean what I say. Some of that explicit communication around what the task is really important up front, building trust, having a shared understanding of what the task is, the why, and the tools to make it happen. So I know that's a long-winded, kind of response, but I don't think it's something that we can take seriously enough, that building of trust and a really strong understanding of what the task is and the why we're doing it along the way.
Thanks, Kathy. And I know that you and I shared a forum recently where someone made a really interesting point that it's not about how do we get them to collaborate. It's also about how do we collaborate with them. You know, it's not just an external thing. And if we can't be part of that process, there's no way that we can, you know, just shepherd it in the way that we want to. We have to be part of that process to do those things. That's great. I really appreciate that. Kath or Jen?
I thought one of the questions that's in the chat I might piggyback on. Would that be okay?
Sure, you can throw that spanner in the works, Kath. That would be fine.
Because it aligns with one of the questions that I had too. Sue has asked a question. What are you assessing and reporting on? Anything other than subject content? I've heard mention of collaboration. What about other skills? I was wondering, you know, as you were learning in STEM that you realise were being neglected, and how PBL provided you with opportunities to more effectively recognise those areas and then attend to them. And you did mention collaboration, of course, and you have mentioned aspects of metacognitive reasoning. I was wondering if there were any other aspects that you're realising now that generally are neglected and you need to pay attention to.
I might start. One of the big things that we've noticed once we've created bigger problems for the students to work on in STEM rather than in science or in mathematics is that we've got a whole heap more emphasis on them really taking their experimentation, creating really good hypotheses and then testing them, and not just a single, we're going to do a prac now, here's your hypothesis pre-formatted for you, do this, it should do this. And there's no formulaic kind of, here's the answer. They have to develop their hypothesis. They really have to test their hypothesis. They have to come back and actually prove or disprove. And we're very enthusiastic when they get questions, when they prove themselves wrong. It's like, oh, that's the best type of science, when you can actually go through and actually prove yourself wrong. So there's parts of the standard science and maths curriculum that that real problem solving aspect that we notice kind of gets glossed over. It's put in the textbook, here's the problem solving piece to your learning knowledge in this area, but there's never really a real problem solving task. And when I feel like science and maths is very much about solving big problems, we really give them the opportunity to do that. There is the other side of this, though, of things that we're meant to be able to achieve in a certain amount of time. And sometimes those demand are, but they're not dealt with in the kind of textbook chapter by chapter expectation. So when students leave year 9 and they go to year 10, there is sometimes this perception that because they don't know this particular word that aligns with this very specific part of the curriculum in maths or science, or they haven't done this particular type of equation in maths, that they haven't learned the whole skills altogether. Whereas if they dig a little bit more, they'll find that they actually have a very good, deep understanding of what the foundation of that is. And from there, they've got a very good launching point to take bigger steps into those key knowledge areas.
Maybe just to follow on from what Michael was saying, we found early on that we weren't always being explicit as to what we were, in relation to some of these skills, or what we were teaching, and making it really clear to students that if we were doing an inquiry into a particular problem, of what the outcomes of the inquiry were. Students will have the perception that they would be learning about the context of the problem and not necessarily identifying those skills that they were using throughout. And so there might be skills such as being able to regulate themselves and set particular goals and strategies in place to help them do that. Whether it's asking questions, whether it's through like the metacognitive sort of questions about themselves, or asking questions of each other. So we've just tried to make it a bit more explicit for them as well. So when they go into year 10, they have a better idea of the skills that they actually learned. and hopefully be able to see where those could be utilised in other areas. But that would probably be something that would be for us to work on moving forward to help them make the links between these skills and areas outside of the context of STEM.
Thanks, Daniel. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Kath. I think, Pete, do you have one more question that you would like to ask someone on the panel?
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Jen. I've got a burning question for Sandra, actually. As I said before, I really like the idea that these job clusters of generators, designers, informers, artisans, coordinators, technologists is a really powerful idea, I think, to consider why we're doing PBL. I wanted to ask whether or not the students saw a kind of connection between those jobs and those clusters and those skills and what they were doing in the classroom, or did you make that explicit to those students, Sandra?
No, they did a lot of research beforehand. So they actually had to research the job that they wanted to go in. If they wanted to be a nurse, well, what do you need to do to be a nurse and what sort of things happen? And that's where they chose their job cluster from. It came from that.
That answers the question in a powerful way, I think. So a direct relevance, we've got building for what they wanted to do later on. I think that's an amazing lesson.
What's really important and what we found sometimes is it's really, really important to get the right organisations giving the right design brief, because you can very easily lose the kids. We're talking 16-year-olds who really want to work, or they think they want to work in this sector or a certain job cluster. But sometimes, I mean, I'm making our program sound fantastic, and I think it is, but there have been times where some of the job clusters just haven't stood up to what the kids expected. And so we always have to go back and tweak it and make sure that the design briefs that they're given match up with what those students expect. Now, sometimes in real life, in our jobs, we have to do things we don't want to do, and we explain this to our students as well. But there's got to be a buy-in from the kids as well. You've got to, otherwise you end up losing them. So yeah, that's where we're coming from with those students.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sandra.
Perfect. Thanks, Pete. Thank you, Kath, for running that section for us, and thank you to our panellists. Just going to give our panellists just a moment to catch their breaths before our Q&A session. And it's my pleasure to mention the Monash Master of Education in STEM Education, which will be available in 2024. If you're interested in developing your professional expertise and advance your career in education, we do invite you to consider the Master of Education in STEM Ed. There are February and July intakes. You can study on campus and off campus in full-time and part-time modes. So we welcome you to please see the website for more details about how to apply. Now, I would like to open up our Q&A section for this evening. I just want to start by thanking all the speakers for their very engaging discussion and for sharing their valuable and important insights. I also wish to thank the audience for your questions, which I would now like to direct to some of our speakers. So if they can please be ready to put on their unmute themselves, that would be great. Billy, I might start with you, please. We had a question from James Kennedy. And this might be relevant to some of the others as well, but I might direct it at Billy first. How did you manage the student use of ChatGPT during your project?
Yeah, so I think that's been a big question for us as educators just across the system, not just necessarily in STEM projects. So for us, we've sort of targeted that the similar way we approach it for other subjects, and we've really focused on that authentication of student work. So STEM's actually a space, I feel like, where that's a little bit easier to do because students are generally working from journals, and because they're creating those design folios, we've already been getting students to track their thinking before ChatGPT was a thing. So I've found it sort of easier to authenticate student work in my STEM classes than it might be, for example, in my Year 11 Math Methods class. I've found that more difficult because that's just a bit of a paradigm shift in those kinds of subjects. Whereas in STEM, students have been recording their thinking the entire way. Now, could they still be using it? Absolutely. But because I've got that evidence of student work over time, I'm more confident that I can see sort of changes in their thinking that aren't necessarily commensurate with their ability levels a little bit easier in STEM. So I think the advice I give for STEM projects is similar I give to sort of any part of teaching practice, which is really strengthen those student authentication processes and have those policies in place to deal with ChatGPT. But I think it's certainly a question we're going to have to keep asking ourselves, because it's definitely something that we're all dealing with at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Billy. And James, I hope that answered your question there. I might now throw to Sandra, if I could. Sandra, if you'd like to unmute. The question here is from Ahmad, who said, PBL is often very expensive to implement. How can one deal with the implementation of PBL in poorer countries, for example? So maybe, Sandra, you might like to kick us off with that one about how you resource your STEM project.
Wow. So what we did initially was we put out feelers to our parents, to be honest. So our local community, to our parents who were in businesses who might come along on the journey of PBL. In terms of monetary, it is not an expensive process because we don't pay these organisations to come on board. We tell them about our program, and they're really happy to have partnerships with us. So yeah, where the problems lie is the timing and being able to get organisations to come on board. So in terms of poorer communities or poorer countries, I would probably start closer to home first of all. So perhaps parents, anyone that the school has, or even design briefs within the school that may be going on, some STEM or some PBL things that are happening around, or that can be turned into PBL questions around the school.
Thanks, Sandra. Would any of the other panelists like to speak to that question? Maybe Kathy, about how you resource your STEM programs?
I'm happy to, because in previous context, I came from having the joys of a number of epilogue laser cutters, and that was a very different world to the one I'm in now. So I've had the full breadth of experience, and gee, it's great to be able to go and hit the laser cutter like nobody's business. But at the same time, one of the great joys of working with creative students is a reductionist approach. And so actually limiting materials produces a really fantastic experience often if the task is well situated within that, or directing students towards a problem that actually involves materials as part of the challenge. So for example, in looking at the homeless issue that we have in Beaudesert and thinking about pop-up shelter for people who are in those situations, you actually have to consider materials that are relevant in that context of being cheap and easily sourced. I love the idea of going to the tip and actually looking at an excursion that would leverage the materials that are found objects in those spaces and understanding what the wastes of communities are, and digging deep, no pun intended, into those spaces before even getting started with a project, and understanding what the waste actually looks like in a particular community. And believe it or not, students actually get really excited about those ideas. Sure, with wearable art, if you've got lots of money, you can go ahead and you can buy things that'll, bring a suit jacket to life and what have you. But you can also put a $5, bunch of aluminium foil pile together in a classroom and go absolutely nuts with tweezers and tiny little implements and create things based on micro cuts and magic. And really, so often the prompt is what creates a sense of delight, awe, and fascination with students. So being clever with not just the materials, but the prompt is what it's all about. So I think that there are definitely openings. Some of them would be site-specific, material dependent, but it's really about creating that hook to be, to be really connected to what's going to allow the students to be excited about the learning. The money's really not the defining factor of a great PBL project.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kathy.
Jennifer, can I just add to that? Sorry.
Sure, Sandra.
Because I wasn't thinking about materials when I was answering it. We've got laser cutters and all that at school too, and we very rarely use them for PBL. It really is about recycled materials, some cardboards, boxes that are around the school that we find. And I would agree with Kathy, it's not really about the big expensive products in the end, it's really the design thinking.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sandra. That's great. The next question hasn't been directed necessarily to any one of you, so I wouldn't mind asking the panel how they would like to answer this one. But Amit has asked about, can you please talk about language as a barrier to PBL and STEM? Have you had an experience with this? And I'm just putting it to the panel to see if anyone nods at me and would like to unmute for this particular question.
I think you could look at that from two ways, couldn't you? I suppose you're looking at perhaps students for whom English is not their first language and engaging in a process. But one of the things, and of course, teachers have specific skills about engaging those students and attending to their needs and making sure that they have access, to participate. One of the things that I was thinking about too when I was listening to the teachers this evening was the important role that a shared language around PBL starts to play for everybody, even teachers working with teachers and students talking to students and students to teachers. And so I was considering the role of language in terms of part of PBL pedagogy, and so maybe even push that question a little bit wider, because I was reminded that in order to assess, when Michael and Daniel were talking about even observing students collaborating, they were able to articulate with students what they saw them doing and then encouraging them to move to the next level of collaboration. So there was a language around that which enabled them to do so. So I think that even in the workshops that we've run, language seems to be critical and a central point to PBL. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment about not only making sure that language is not a barrier for students to participate, but that schools work at developing language around PBL. Not sure.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Kath. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Jennifer, I think when you start to work in PBL or in STEM in general, there's that design thinking language. And so I think that's the first language they learn, and that's really important. And kind of once they grasp that, that first part of it is to empathize. If we start with that with Year 7 students, they don't know what that means. So that's the language we teach them, and we really are explicit about what those things mean, all those things mean. And the other big one is creative confidence. Because if they don't know that, and that's what you really need to be able to, have success in your projects. So we make it a point at our school that design thinking's great. It's pretty much the be all and end all, but you need to have creative confidence as well. So in terms of language, they're the words we use with our students.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sandra. Shell, our partner investigator at Max, how are you this evening? Would you like to wade into this question?
Yes, just I think everything everybody has said is correct. And Cass talking about shared language and a shared understanding of methodology and everything's important. But we also see from many of our students in our schools that participate in some of our big programs or projects, that when children are engaged in project work and they understand what they're doing, then their language is not a barrier, or they will, or as a barrier that can be overcome. So we certainly see students, we've got a lot of recent refugees and migrants to the country in many of our schools in the outer north and west, who are actually successfully participating in our big projects like STEM Mad to make a difference in showcases, and they can, to a degree, articulate their learning. We also have those students who are neurodiverse, and I know I whack on about that quite a lot, but we see a lot of those students who are inhibited by other types of literacies and understandings that can be successful when they're engaged in solving a problem. And they'll find a way round to solve that problem and to get what they need from their teachers. So the interaction between teachers and students in that space is really a joy to observe.
Thanks, Shell. That's great.
Jen, could I have a word to that too, please?
Absolutely, Pete.
As you might predict, this is a passionate aspect of many of us, the researchers on the project, because we find that, we can't understand the purpose of a shared language is so that we can have a shared understanding. And the deep principles that we're developing about PBL depend on that language and that thinking. I also think that what's really important is to be able to speak to each other about our reasoning and thinking. And that understanding of the reasoning is a really important part of collaboration, is that we think together. We have to be able to communicate our reasoning with each other, understanding our reasoning as far more of a social competence than an individual faculty. So I think the language around our thinking and talking is a really important idea. And so to whatever barriers there might be there, I think that's a nice place to be working as well. Understanding thinking as part of collaboration.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pete. That's great. I think this fits in nicely with the last question that I'll ask, I think, depending on how much time we have left. And I'd like to direct this to Dan, to you. I think this is a question, I think you talked about this before. Problem-based learning is supposed to promote the development of critical and creative thinking skills. This is a question from Sue. I think you've mentioned this. Did you observe this in your teaching?
I suppose it's quite difficult in terms of observing this type of skill, because a lot of critical creative thinking is internal. And so a lot of the times, some of the things we've been exploring at the moment kind of cross over a bit with that metacognitive reasoning, and getting students to write down what they're thinking and to write down their thought process and how what they're thinking about when they're dealing with a problem. To be able to really think critically about something, there needs to be some form of knowledge and understanding of what they're thinking critically about. So we've found that when we've done some inquiry-based learning and PBL, that if we didn't teach students a little bit about the problem first, their ability to think creative and come up with creative ideas and solutions to that problem weren't quite as good as when we would provide some more information about hopefully that answers the question a little bit.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. Now, I think I just wanted to touch on Yanlin's question, because I think it raises some important points here. And I'd like to put this to the panel, please. This will be our last question for this evening. How does PBL provide support to students who have diversity needs, especially for students with special needs, for example? How can you include these in your STEM program, and maybe what challenges did you face? So if one of our panel members would like to speak to that. I know Mel Gatt, one of the other teachers in our program, has her SWANS program at St. Peter's, which would be great for us to connect to Yanlin. But would anyone here on the panel like to speak to that one?
I'll jump in.
Thanks, Mike.
We've found a lot of the students that we have that have additional learning needs, and because it's protected at where they're going, they get a lot more freedom to explore, and we find that they're much more engaged. And once we've got that engagement, we can actually see them trying things that they might not have done previously. We're finding that with not just those students who have additional learning needs because of disability, but those kids who have additional learning needs because of long-term disengagement, and just being able to get them some buy-in, and it gives them that confidence to actually continue. So just the buy-in at the start has been a massive change to a lot of the feelings of success of those students, and their ability to then move on and take a little bit more control of their learning.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike.
I think
Did you want to add something,
it kind of also comes back to what Billy was mentioning before about with problem-based learning really lends itself well when you have well-constructed problems for a low floor and a high ceiling. And the great thing as well is that there's not necessarily one correct answer, such has been the case with, say, mathematics, where the students are looking for that answer. And then I guess in this case with PBL, they're able to explore, and it's a little bit more, low risk, I suppose.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. Now, I am conscious of time, not wanting to keep people too late tonight. So I would like to wrap things up now. I just want to take this moment to thank all of our speakers on our panel this evening for their time and for sharing their insights and engaging in the discussion about PBL in STEM. Such amazing stories there. A big thank you very much to our partner organisations who I have already mentioned. And I would also like to thank the people behind the scenes who have worked very hard to make this event possible. Special thanks to Tabitha and Tanya, our fantastic RAs in the project, and also to the marketing team at Monash who supported us as well. We would like to keep the conversation going, so please reach out to us if you have any questions or you would like to connect with us here in the project, and we look forward to being able to communicate more findings from our fantastic project to you in the future. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our panelists.